In the spring of 1509, a 17-year-old prince ascended to the throne of England with the face of an angel and the build of a warrior. Henry Tudor, the eighth of his name, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. He composed music, wrote poetry, jousted with abandon, and spoke 4 languages fluently. The courts of Europe whispered that England had found its golden king. No one could have imagined that this Renaissance prince would become the man who executed 2 of his wives, severed his nation from 1,000 years of religious tradition, and left a trail of corpses that would define an entire century. But to understand how such darkness could bloom from such promise, we must first understand where the Tudors came from and what they were willing to do to keep their crown. The Tudor claim to the English throne was, by any honest measure, questionable at best. Henry's grandfather, Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, had been a Welsh exile with a genealogical connection to royalty so distant it required creative interpretation and selective memory. He had spent 14 years in Brittany and France, a fugitive from Yorkist England, watching from across the Channel as the Wars of the Roses consumed the country in cycles of revenge and blood. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, descended from an illegitimate line that had been explicitly barred from the succession decades earlier. But Margaret Beaufort was a woman who understood that power belonged to those who seized it and held it, not those who deserved it by birthright. She maneuvered, plotted, and waited with the patience of someone who knew that in England's chaos, an opportunity would eventually present itself. That opportunity came on a field in Leicestershire on the 22nd of August, 1485. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, led his forces against Henry Tudor's army at Bosworth Field. The battle should have been a slaughter. Richard commanded superior numbers and held the high ground. But at the crucial moment, key nobles who had promised Richard their support held back or switched sides entirely. Richard found himself isolated, his cavalry charge cut down, and in the brutal confusion of close combat, he was killed. According to later accounts, his crown was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield, still sticky with blood and dirt. It was a coronation born of violence, and violence would remain the family's constant companion. Henry VII understood that his grip on power was tenuous. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York in a symbolic reconciliation that satisfied almost no one but made open rebellion slightly more complicated. He ruthlessly suppressed any rival claims to the throne, executing the young Earl of Warwick, whose only crime was having Plantagenet blood in his veins. He tracked down and eliminated pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, men who claimed to be lost Yorkist princes and gathered support from European powers eager to destabilize England. Henry built a network of informers, imposed heavy fines on nobles who stepped out of line, and accumulated wealth with the dedication of a merchant rather than the grandeur of a king. He established financial controls that made him wealthy and unpopular in equal measure. By the time he died in 1509, he had given England stability, but it was the cold stability of a miser's locked strongbox, not the warm confidence of a beloved monarch. His son, the Golden Prince who became Henry VIII, inherited a secure throne and a full treasury. He would spend both with abandon. The young Henry seemed determined to be everything his father was not. Where Henry VII had been cautious and calculating, Henry VIII was bold and impulsive. Where the old king had hoarded gold, the young one spent it on tournaments, pageants, and wars that accomplished little beyond displaying English might. He invaded France in 1513, won the minor Battle of the Spurs, and returned home celebrating as though he had conquered half of Europe. He commissioned palaces, collected tapestries and manuscripts, and surrounded himself with musicians, poets, and scholars. His court became a center of Renaissance culture, drawing talent from across Europe. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, a Spanish princess 6 years his senior who brought diplomatic alliance and genuine affection to the marriage. For nearly 20 years, they were partners in rule, if not quite equals. Catherine had survived the chaos of her early widowhood in England, where she had been left in political limbo after Arthur Tudor's death, and she possessed a steely dignity that would serve her in the trials ahead. But Catherine could not give Henry what he wanted most desperately: a living son. She bore him 6 children. 5 died in infancy or shortly after birth. Only Mary, born in 1516, survived. In an age where royal succession meant everything, where civil war was a living memory, and where the very concept of a ruling queen was almost unthinkable in England, Henry's lack of a male heir became an obsession. He watched his sister Margaret's son in Scotland, his sister Mary's children, and he saw the succession slipping toward branches of the family he could not control. He looked at his robust frame, his reputation for virility, and concluded that the fault must lie with Catherine, now in her 40s and past childbearing age. But Henry was not a man who admitted his desires plainly. He needed his pursuit of a new wife to be righteous, justified not by lust or ambition, but by theological principle. And so he convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God because she had been his brother's wife, that the biblical prohibition in Leviticus against such unions explained why his sons had died, and that only by ending this sinful marriage could he secure England's future. The problem was that Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe who controlled Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. And the Pope, Clement VII, was at that moment essentially a prisoner of Charles after the brutal sack of Rome in 1527, when imperial troops had rampaged through the Holy City, killing, looting, and desecrating churches in an orgy of violence that shocked all of Christendom. The idea that the Pope would annul the marriage of Charles's aunt to please an English king was fantastical. But Henry pressed forward anyway, initiating what became known as the King's Great Matter, a legal and theological battle that would consume years and ultimately reshape the entire religious landscape of England. He appointed Thomas Wolsey, his Lord Chancellor and a cardinal of the Church, to secure the annulment. Wolsey had risen from humble origins to become the second most powerful man in England, living in palaces that rivaled the king's own. But for all his accumulated power and ecclesiastical connections, Wolsey could not move Rome. He failed. He was stripped of power, arrested on charges of treason, and died while being transported to London for trial in November 1530, his career destroyed by his inability to deliver what Henry demanded. Into Wolsey's place stepped Thomas Cromwell, a man of common birth with an uncommon talent for ruthless efficiency. Cromwell had traveled Europe as a young man, serving as a soldier, merchant, and banker, learning languages and laws, observing how power functioned in different kingdoms. He had worked for Wolsey, and when Wolsey fell, Cromwell did not fall with him. Instead, he presented Henry with a solution so radical it seemed impossible until it was accomplished. Cromwell saw what others had missed, that the problem was not how to convince the Pope, but how to eliminate the Pope's authority over England entirely. He began orchestrating a revolution disguised as legal reform. Parliament passed a series of acts that steadily cut the ties binding England to Rome. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 declared that England was an empire unto itself, subject to no foreign power. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a masterstroke of political engineering. Henry got his annulment, declared his marriage to Catherine invalid, and married Anne Boleyn, a dark-eyed woman of the English gentry who had refused to become his mistress and held out for the crown itself. Anne Boleyn had spent years at the French court, absorbing the elegance and sophistication of Francis I's circle. She was educated, witty, and unafraid to express opinions in a world where women's voices were expected to be soft and deferential. She had caught Henry's attention around 1526, and for 6 years he pursued her while his marriage to Catherine slowly unraveled. Anne calculated that her only protection lay in becoming queen, not concubine, and she held firm even as the pressure mounted. When they finally married in January 1533, Anne was already pregnant. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533, and the disappointment in the king's eyes must have been devastating. Henry had broken with Rome, defied the greatest powers in Europe, and torn his kingdom apart, all on the promise of a son. Instead, he had another daughter. She miscarried a son in January 1536, and by April of that year, Cromwell had manufactured a case against her that was as flimsy as it was deadly. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, charges that historians now recognize as almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was extracted through intimidation, the testimonies contradictory and implausible. But the legal machinery, once set in motion, was unstoppable. The real crime was her failure to produce a son and her own sharp tongue in a court where women were expected to be decorative and obedient. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt before a French swordsman on Tower Green and was beheaded with a single stroke. She was 35 years old. According to witnesses, she maintained her composure to the end, making a brief speech in which she declined to speak ill of the king who had condemned her. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, a quiet woman from an ambitious family who understood that survival meant submission. Jane Seymour gave Henry what he wanted: a son, Edward, born in October 1537 after a difficult labor. She died 12 days later from complications of childbirth, likely from infection that set in after the delivery. Henry mourned her genuinely, or as genuinely as a man of his nature could mourn, because she had fulfilled her purpose without complicating his life. She would be the wife buried beside him when he finally died. But England now had its male heir, a sickly infant prince whose very existence justified everything Henry had done. The break with Rome was complete and irreversible. The monasteries, those ancient houses of prayer and learning and hospitality that had stood for centuries, were being systematically dissolved. Cromwell orchestrated this dissolution with bureaucratic precision, sending commissioners to inventory every monastery, pressuring abbots to surrender their houses voluntarily, and crushing resistance where it appeared. It was the largest transfer of property in England since the Norman Conquest, redistributing perhaps 1/5 of the nation's wealth, and it created a class of beneficiaries who had every reason to ensure the Reformation could never be reversed. Henry married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, a German princess, was chosen for diplomatic reasons. But when she arrived in England in December 1539, Henry found her physically unappealing. The marriage was annulled within months, and Anne, showing more wisdom than her predecessors, accepted a generous settlement and lived quietly in England for another 17 years. Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's young cousin, became wife number 5. She was perhaps 19 when she married the king, vivacious and foolish, thrust into the orbit of a man who was now in his 50s, increasingly obese, his leg ulcerated and foul-smelling, his temper volcanic. Catherine may have had relationships before her marriage, and she almost certainly conducted an affair with Thomas Culpeper after it. When evidence reached Henry, he reportedly wept before ordering her arrest. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded on Tower Green. She was perhaps 20 years old. Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, was an educated widow who had already buried 2 husbands when she married the king in 1543. She was intellectually curious, sympathetic to religious reform, and possessed the diplomatic skill to navigate Henry's dangerous moods. She nursed him through his final years as his health deteriorated and survived him, dying in 1548 after marrying Thomas Seymour with almost indecent haste. When Henry died on the 28th of January, 1547, he left behind 3 children from 3 different marriages, each with a claim to the throne, each representing a different vision of England's religious future. Edward, the boy king, was 9 years old and in the hands of Protestant advisors who pushed the Reformation further than Henry had ever intended. His uncle Edward Seymour became Lord Protector and accelerated religious reform. Churches were stripped of their images, statues smashed, wall paintings whitewashed over, the Latin Mass replaced with English services. The Book of Common Prayer imposed liturgical uniformity across England. Edward himself was a committed Protestant, educated by reformist tutors and convinced of the rightness of the new faith. But he was frail, and by his 15th year, it was clear he was dying of tuberculosis. On his deathbed in the summer of 1553, influenced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Edward attempted to alter the succession to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. He named instead his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey, a studious teenager who had no desire for the crown. It was a desperate gambit that failed within days. When Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553, and Jane was proclaimed queen, the country rose not for the Protestant claimant, but for Mary Tudor, the rightful heir. Jane's reign lasted 9 days before Mary entered London in triumph. Mary Tudor took the throne in 1553 with overwhelming popular support. She had endured decades of humiliation, declared illegitimate by her father, separated from her dying mother, forced to acknowledge the invalidity of her parents' marriage just to survive. Her accession seemed like divine justice, and she was determined to return England to the Catholic fold. She released religious prisoners, restored the Latin Mass, and began negotiations with Rome. She married Philip of Spain, linking England to the great Catholic power of Europe in a union deeply unpopular among her subjects. When persuasion failed to restore the old faith as quickly as Mary hoped, she turned to fire. The heresy laws were revived, and Protestant leaders who refused to recant were burned at the stake. Thomas Cranmer, architect of the English Reformation, was burned in Oxford in March 1556. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley were burned together in Oxford in October 1555. Over Mary's 5-year reign, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake for heresy. These executions, meant to purge England of religious error, instead created martyrs whose stories would be retold for generations. The burnings earned her a nickname that would outlast any other memory: Bloody Mary. Mary died childless in November 1558, probably of ovarian cancer, believing herself a failure. She had lost Calais, England's last possession in France. Her husband Philip had returned to Spain. Her efforts to restore Catholicism had created martyrs rather than converts. The throne passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child whose birth had caused such upheaval and who had spent her youth in dangerous shadows, never quite safe, never quite legitimate. Elizabeth was 25, red-haired, sharp-minded, and determined never to make her sister's mistakes. Elizabeth would rule for 45 years, restoring a moderate Protestantism that sought accommodation. She crafted the Elizabethan religious settlement, a middle way that retained bishops and ceremony while embracing Protestant theology. She defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, the great fleet Philip sent to invade England, a victory that established England as a serious naval power. She presided over a cultural flowering that produced William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. She carefully constructed her image as the Virgin Queen married to England itself, turning her unmarried state into a symbol of dedication to her realm. She never married, rejecting suitors from Philip of Spain to Robert Dudley. Perhaps she understood that any husband would diminish her power. Perhaps she was scarred by her father's marriages and her mother's execution. Perhaps she simply refused to risk her life in childbirth. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth remained single, and England remained stable through her refusal to create disputed succession through marriage. When Elizabeth died on the 24th of March, 1603, the Tudor line died with her. The throne passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, uniting the crowns and beginning the Stuart dynasty. But the Tudors had accomplished something extraordinary in their century of rule. They had taken a throne won by force and held it through intelligence, brutality, and adaptation. They had broken with Rome and created a national church that defined English identity for centuries. They had executed rivals, spouses, and subjects with cold efficiency whenever power demanded it. They had transformed England from a second-tier kingdom into an emerging power. The cost was measured in bodies and broken faith. 2 queens beheaded, monasteries destroyed, thousands burned or hanged for their beliefs, a nation torn between competing visions of truth and forced to choose sides in quarrels as much about power as theology. The Tudors did not create religious violence in England, but they refined it, systematized it, and made it a tool of statecraft. They understood that to rule was to dominate, that mercy was a luxury afforded only to those secure in their power, and that the crown was worth any price as long as someone else paid it. This was the dynasty that beheaded wives and broke Christianity, not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were willing to do what power required in an age when hesitation meant death, and the throne belonged to whoever could hold it longest.